On the afternoon of Wednesday, March 31st, 2010, at 2:00 p.m. in York, Pennsylvania, at a Hooters restaurant, John Schmier and his friends gathered. It was not a business meeting, but a pleasure club, a time for successful men to relax with food and casual conversation. They had even given themselves a clever, self-appointed name, calling their close-knit group the Orange Shorts Society. Today, however, this small sanctuary would become a crime scene. A violent event would occur miles away, one that every piece of evidence seemed to dismiss, yet the murder had been planned for this exact moment. Every receipt was in place, no cash was taken, no forced entry occurred, no getaway car was seen. Still, a woman was murdered in daylight inside a guarded lobby by her dearest friend. The reality was that a seemingly random home invasion and murder would soon be traced back to this very table. Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight. If you are the kind of person who stays up late listening to real stories like this, and you find something strangely compelling about mysteries that law enforcement still has not fully solved, I would really appreciate it if you hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You can tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now, because there is something about late night that makes these stories feel different, right? Now, before we go any further, lock your door and turn off the lights, because what comes next will show how a monster can hide right in plain sight. Outside the window, the rain has started. At first, it was only light drops on the glass, but then it turns steadier, heavier, the kind of rain that washes away footprints and makes backroads soft and quiet. It was the same kind of rain falling over that town the night they found her. And this is where the story begins. The man at the heart of this small gathering was John Schmier, a man who, at 59 years old, had built a very successful career as a retired eye doctor. He enjoyed coming to this restaurant a couple of times a month, and the easy camaraderie of his social club was a comforting ritual for him. But today, the conversation turned, as it often did, to a more unpleasant subject: his ex-wife, Monica. John's friends were used to his tirades about her. John resented paying her alimony following their divorce 7 years earlier, and he told anyone who would listen that she had made the payments deliberately cumbersome. According to him, Monica would not accept a bank transfer, forcing him to take out cash from an ATM each week and physically drive it to her house in an envelope. This was, John claimed, a purely spiteful act designed to punish him for the failure of their 20-year marriage. It was a point of bitterness that John would share with everyone at the table over and over again. He told his friends that Monica hated him, that she had made his life difficult, and most importantly, he always mentioned the cash. He openly complained that Monica had all this cash, bags full of it, because she forced him to deliver the alimony in cash. This single repetitive detail, planted in the minds of his close friends, would soon prove to be the unintended blueprint for a capital crime. Meanwhile, entirely separate from the Orange Shorts Society meeting, police were rushing to Monica's house. A frantic 911 call had come in moments before, but when the operator answered, there was only silence. Standard protocol dictated that first responders must be dispatched to check on the caller. When the officers arrived, the scene was eerily quiet, the suburban streets still and calm. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no doors kicked in. It looked like a quiet afternoon at home. The police knocked several times with no answer, so they tried the front door, finding it unlocked. They stepped inside and saw the horrific scene immediately. Monica Schmier was lying dead on the floor next to the telephone, a single gunshot wound to her head. Detective Douglas Demagon arrived with his team to what appeared to be a botched robbery, but the crime scene told a different story. Monica's purse, found next to her body, contained her identification, and a single .32 caliber shell casing lay nearby. But the most confusing detail was the cash. There was cash everywhere, tucked into drawers, stashed in trash cans, and placed in envelopes on tables. The sheer amount of cash scattered throughout the house suggested that robbery was unlikely, as nothing appeared to have been taken. Other valuables were still in place. It seemed someone had come in not to steal, but specifically to kill. The investigation began to focus on who Monica knew. Since there was no forced entry, the killer either knew her, had a key, or simply walked in through an unlocked door. Detective Demagon found a Rolodex, an old-fashioned contact book, which led him to her ex-husband, John Schmier. That evening, Detective Demagon arrived at John's house. The ex-husband is always suspect number one in a homicide investigation, regardless of the apparent motive. Demagon watched John closely as he delivered the news. "Your ex-wife has been murdered." John's reaction was huge, clutching his chest and seeming to sob with dramatic intensity. But the experienced detective noticed a crucial, small detail. Despite the performance, there were no actual tears in John's eyes. Demagon asked John about his whereabouts at the time of the shooting. John stopped his rocking and chest clutching immediately, looked the detective in the eye, and said, "I was at Hooters with my friends." The alibi was confirmed by all the members of the Orange Short Society. Every man at that table swore that John had been present the entire time, that he could not possibly have left, driven across town, committed a murder, and returned without anyone noticing. The sheer weight of these multiple alibis was enough to turn suspicion away from John Schmier entirely. The case seemed to hit a dead end, all initial leads exhausted. The investigators even explored the idea of a hired hitman, given John's resentment and wealth, but found nothing that could connect him to a hired killer. The sheer frustration was immense. John was the only viable suspect with a clear motive, yet he had an ironclad alibi, a room full of successful professionals swearing to his presence. After 3 months of looking into random leads, Detective Demagon decided to go back to the beginning. He would start over. He reviewed all the evidence, every police report, every grainy photograph. He asked the manager of the Hooters to pull the security footage again. He sat down and watched the video, frame by frame, the same footage he had seen 1,000 times. He was looking for any deviation, any small thing everyone else had missed. He watched the group laughing, talking, drinking, and then he saw it. A minor discrepancy, a single detail that held the secret to the entire crime. The camera blinked out for one member, exactly at the time of death, a detail missed 1,000 times. The truth here was not in a mob hit or a failed robbery. It was far more insidious, lurking in the easy confidence of friendship. The detective realized the alibi, while solid for John, was only partial for the group itself. Monica's killer was much closer than anyone had imagined. This killer had heard John speak openly about Monica's alimony, her cash-filled envelopes, and he decided to take advantage. This seemingly minor detail changes everything. Now, let's travel across state lines to the afternoon of Wednesday, March 31st, 2010 at 3:00 p.m., where the investigation finally breaks open. The camera turned, and the real killer was revealed. This time, the clock mattered. On the afternoon of Wednesday, March 31st, 2010, at 3:00 p.m. in York, Pennsylvania, at a Hooters restaurant, Detective Demagon began his review. He had returned to the security footage, the grainy black and white images of John Schmier and his friends, the supposed Orange Short Society sitting at their table. He was desperate for a new angle, something missed in the initial flood of information. Every man at the table had confirmed John Schmier's alibi, swearing he was present the entire time. This was the most frustrating part of the case. The only suspect with a motive seemed to be the one man who couldn't have done it. The police had operated on the assumption that all the men present that day constituted the entire social club. They all met up every time, or so the men had told the police. John Schmear's resentment of his ex-wife was well known, constantly talking about the alimony payments and the huge amounts of cash Monica kept at her house. The sheer repetition of this one detail, the bags of cash she forced him to deliver, must have sounded like a lottery ticket to someone desperate enough. The initial theory of the police was that John, who hated making these cumbersome payments, may have hired a hitman, but no evidence of a transaction, a burner phone, or any communication with a known professional killer ever materialized. The trail for a hired killer went nowhere. As the detective watched the surveillance footage again, a small but powerful detail emerged. It was less about who was in the picture and more about who was missing. The entire social club was seated, chatting and laughing, seemingly oblivious to the horrific act occurring miles away. But DeMagan realized that one regular member, a man named Tim Jacobi, was nowhere to be seen. He was one of the key pillars of the Orange Short Society, one of the guys who supposedly never missed a meetup. But on the day of the murder, Tim Jacobi was absent. This was the small discrepancy, the tiny oversight that the friends had made when confirming John's alibi. They had been so focused on protecting John, the suspect, that they inadvertently created an alibi for the real killer. Tim Jacobi was interviewed with the rest of the group, and he claimed he had simply missed the meeting due to a scheduling conflict, but the detective didn't believe it. He began to look into Tim Jacobi's life, pulling his financial records and credit card statements. He was surprised to find Tim was struggling financially, facing deep debt and desperation. He was living a life that contrasted sharply with the prosperous facade he presented at the Hooters meetings. He was also one of the men who had heard John's repetitive complaints, knowing that Monica was flushed with cash every week. The new theory was chillingly simple. Tim Jacobi had skipped the meeting, gone to Monica's house with the intention of robbing her, not killing her. He walked in, perhaps the door was left unlocked, or perhaps Monica let him in as a friend of John's, and then the situation immediately escalated. When Monica fought back or realized his intentions, he shot her with a .32 caliber pistol. He panicked after the shooting, fleeing without taking the cash he was so desperate for, explaining why all the envelopes were still scattered throughout the house. The police quickly moved in on Tim Jacobi, armed with a warrant and the growing realization of his guilt. The forensic team was sent back to the crime scene, conducting a deeper sweep for trace evidence. They needed a physical link, something beyond the powerful but circumstantial narrative. They reanalyzed everything found near Monica's body. They confirmed that Tim's DNA was at the scene. He was quickly arrested. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, including the DNA and the fact he had been absent from the supposed ironclad alibi, Tim Jacobi broke. He admitted to going to Monica's house with the intention of robbing her, fueled by John Schmear's bragging about the cash Monica kept. He was not a hired hitman, he was a deeply indebted friend. He was the most unexpected killer of all, proving that the most dangerous criminals can hide not in the shadows, but right in plain sight among people you think you know. This story ends with an incredibly dark lesson about the casual cruelty of words. John Schmear's continuous bitter complaints about his ex-wife, though not an intent to kill, created the perfect opportunity for murder. The only thing he did do is, at these Orange Short Society meetups, he would talk openly about how he didn't really like Monica. That talk was enough to condemn her. It's a sobering thought, a reminder that we often don't truly know the desperation lurking in the hearts of even our closest friends. The transition to the next case is a journey from financial motive to familial horror. Let's move to Buffalo, New York, where on a chilly September morning at 9:05 a.m., another secret would be uncovered. Everything was there, except the person On the morning of Wednesday, September 12th, 2007, at 9:05 a.m. in Buffalo, New York, at a Bryant and Stratton College dorm room, the police came to the door. Ashley Wallace, a 20-year-old college student, was getting ready for her very first day of classes. She was excited and nervous, feeling the weight of newfound independence. She had just gathered her books when she heard the knock. It was a confusing sound. She hadn't been in her dorm long enough for anyone to know she lived there. Who would be at her door? When she opened it, her confusion immediately turned to a chilling, primal fear. Standing in the hallway were two police officers with grave expressions. Ashley's fear was not born of guilt, but of a deep, unhealed trauma. Her life had been marked by sudden, catastrophic losses. Her biological father had died suddenly of a heart attack when she was just 13. Then, not long after, her stepfather, who had struggled with depression, took his own life. Those twin tragedies had never fully left her. She immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. The police were here to tell her someone else close to her had died, but the officers quickly corrected her. They weren't there to notify her of a new death. They were there to talk about her past, specifically her biological father, who had died 7 years ago. The shock of this statement was immense. What could they possibly want to know about her father now? They delivered their bombshell with a cold, professional detachment. They exhumed your father, and it turns out he very likely did not die of a heart attack. We think he was murdered. Ashley was completely distraught by this news, but worse was the follow-up. The police were not there to console her. They were there to interrogate her. They were looking into the family, including Ashley herself, as suspects in her father's death. The two officers grilled her relentlessly. Every stammer, every confused answer only made her seem more suspicious to them. She was soon sobbing, desperately insisting on her innocence, while the police relentlessly pursued their interrogation. After 30 long minutes, the police left, telling Ashley they would be in touch. She was left alone, reeling from the twin horrors of learning her father was likely murdered and realizing she was now a suspect. She called her mother, Stacy, and learned that her mother had gone through a similar experience that very day. Stacy had also been told her husband was murdered and that she was now under investigation. The two women cried together, completely bewildered, asking the same question: who would want to hurt him? Stacy told Ashley to forget about class and just come home. Ashley drove the hour back to her mother's house and was greeted by her 16-year-old sister, Bree, whose eyes were also red from crying. The entire family had been thrust into a confusing, chaotic nightmare, all of them under suspicion for the murder of their father and husband. They retreated to the kitchen, talking, crying, and trying to make sense of the absurdity of the situation. As the day wore on, Stacy, the mother, poured herself and Ashley a drink to calm the stress. Bree, at only 16, declined. The alcoholic drinks were a moment of shared, dark catharsis. The next morning, Ashley woke up in her mother's house with a terrible, blinding headache. She felt intensely hungover, disproportionately so for the small amount of alcohol she had consumed the night before. She convinced herself it was the emotional stress, not the drinks. She forced herself out of bed, showered, and drove back to her college campus, trying to return to a normal routine. She struggled to focus in her classes, the memory of the police interrogation still a fresh, painful wound. Finally, as the last class of the day ended, the hangover fog began to lift, and she felt well enough to drive back to her mother's house once again. That night, the same scene played out. Ashley, Bree, and Stacy gathered in the kitchen for another cathartic evening of talking and drinking, with Bree opting for a non-alcoholic beverage, while Stacy mixed a few more drinks for herself and Ashley. The next morning, Ashley woke up, and the headache was worse than ever. She was completely disoriented. This time, she wasn't just hungover. The first thought in her mind was, I don't know where I am. The room looked strange. When her eyes finally focused, she realized she was in a hospital bed. Panic set in immediately. There was no family member present, just two police officers sitting against the wall. The officers quickly approached her and explained that her mother had found her unresponsive in bed that morning and called an ambulance. Ashley had been rushed to the hospital and was lucky to be alive. She had been dangerously close to full-blown organ failure. Before she could ask what caused her body to shut down, the officers handed her a piece of paper. "You need to explain yourself," one of them said. The note was a confession and a suicide note, seemingly written by Ashley. It said that the author had killed both her biological father and her stepfather, and that the guilt had driven her to take her own life. The note was signed by Ashley. But Ashley had not written the note, she had not killed her father, the clue had been planted early, antifreeze was the hidden cause. Her mother, Stacy, was the real killer. Stacy had used antifreeze, a slow and painful poison, to murder both her biological father and her stepfather years apart. When the police began investigating the suspicious circumstances of the deaths, Stacy's final desperate act was to try to murder her own daughter. She laced Ashley's alcoholic drinks with painkillers and poison to make it look like a guilt-ridden suicide. The only thing that saved Ashley was the mother's feigned concern, calling the ambulance a little too early the next day. The confession note was a final, chilling manipulation. Stacy was convicted of 2 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder and was sentenced to 51 years in prison, where she later died. The next story is a brutal one, a case of cold, calculated elimination for the sake of money, a motive that hides right in plain sight. Let's travel across the United States to Dallas, Texas, to a quiet parking garage at 5:00 p.m. This time, the clock mattered. On the evening of Wednesday, September 2nd, 2015, at 5:00 p.m. in Dallas, Texas, at the Gables Park 17 garage, Dr. Kendra Hatcher arrived home. The doctor was a dedicated pediatric dentist, 35 years old, and a woman whose compassion and kindness were at the very core of her life. She was a woman of deep faith, often traveling for mission trips. But recently, her life had been made even brighter by a new romance. She had met Dr. Ricardo Paniagua, a dermatologist known as Ricky, through an online dating app. Their relationship had been a whirlwind of happiness. They were already talking about marriage, and they had a trip to Cancun booked for the very next day, a weekend to celebrate their profound connection. Kendra pulled her car into her designated spot in the multi-level concrete garage. She turned off the engine, likely thinking of last-minute packing and the excitement of the trip to come. In that quiet moment of transition, her beautiful, hopeful future was brutally extinguished. A dark figure emerged from the shadows. There was a flash and a deafening roar, a single fatal gunshot to the head. Kendra Hatcher died instantly. The killer fled, taking some of her belongings to make the scene look like a robbery gone horribly wrong. But the truth was infinitely more calculated. The initial report suggested a random robbery homicide, a tragic but familiar urban event. But the execution-style nature of the killing and the fact that valuable items were left behind immediately raised suspicions. This was personal. The architect of the crime was a woman Kendra didn't even know, Brenda Delgado, Ricky's ex-girlfriend. She was obsessed with the idea of winning Ricky back and saw Kendra as an obstacle that needed to be eliminated. Brenda was a dental assistant who had dated Ricky for nearly 3 years, and when he ended the relationship for good, she simply refused to let go. Brenda maintained a secret digital connection to Ricky's life, possessing his passwords and access to his email and iCloud accounts. Through this secret vantage point, she became a silent spectator to his new love story with Kendra. She tracked their texts, their dinner plans, even their airline reservations for the Cancun trip. Every happy picture of Kendra was a fresh wound, twisting her obsession into a cold, methodical rage. Brenda saw Kendra Hatcher as a rival who had stolen the life she believed was rightfully hers. She began to plan Kendra's murder, turning it into her sole dark focus. She knew she couldn't do it alone. Brenda set about recruiting a team of accomplices, people she could easily manipulate. She found Crystal Cortez, a young single mother struggling financially, and offered her $500 to be the getaway driver. Then she recruited Christopher Love, a small-time drug dealer with a criminal record, dangling the promise of thousands of dollars in cash and a steady supply of narcotics. The price for Kendra's life was settled. The plot was set for September 2nd, the day before Kendra and Ricky were due to leave for Cancun. Brenda wanted the murder to destroy not just Kendra, but the happiness she represented. Brenda took meticulous steps to manufacture an alibi, having Crystal drop her off at a library to give the appearance of studying. Crystal, driving a friend's distinctive black Jeep Cherokee, was with Christopher Love, the gunman, in the passenger seat. They followed Kendra to the garage, tailing another vehicle through the security gate. When Kendra pulled into her spot, Christopher Love emerged from the shadows. He shot her once in the head, grabbed a few items, and Crystal Cortez sped them away. The major break in the case came from the surveillance footage that captured the distinct black Jeep Cherokee. A man came forward and told police he had lent his Jeep to his friend Brenda Delgado, the very woman who was supposed to be at the library. Brenda was brought in for questioning, but she was cool, calm, and cooperative, presenting a seemingly solid alibi with a restaurant receipt. She denied all involvement and was released on a minor violation. While Brenda walked free, the police quickly closed in on her accomplices. Christopher Love was arrested, and the police soon found Crystal Cortez. Under questioning, Cortez's story fell apart, and she confessed everything. She detailed how Brenda, driven by jealousy, had orchestrated the entire plot, from the stalking to the payment. But as the net tightened and Brenda realized her web of lies was unraveling, she made a desperate move. She fled, crossing the border into Mexico and becoming a fugitive. The FBI placed Brenda Delgado on its 10 most wanted fugitives list, one of only 9 women to ever be on the notorious list. This international pressure worked, and Brenda was captured just 2 days later. The prosecution agreed to waive the death penalty to secure her extradition. The trial laid out the story of her all-consuming obsession, with Crystal Cortez's chilling testimony as the star witness. She described how Brenda had manipulated and coached her, masterminding every detail of the crime. Brenda Delgado was a master manipulator, and the jury knew it. She was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. It was a story of a rival eliminated, a betrayal so cold and calculated that it shocked the nation. But one case closed does not mean the darkness is gone. Let's cross the Atlantic to Richmond upon Thames, England, for the afternoon of Saturday, March 2nd, 2019 at 3:00 p.m. This time, everything was there, except the person. On the afternoon of Saturday, March 2nd, 2019 at 3:00 p.m. in Richmond upon Thames, England, at a Q flat, Laureline Garcia Bertau was busy packing. She was 34 years old, a vibrant, talented French filmmaker who had made London her home. Laureline was preparing for a fresh start. The lease on her flat was ending, and in a moment of vulnerability, her ex-boyfriend, Kirill Belarusov, had stepped in, offering to help her move into a beautiful new house. This gesture seemed to be an attempt to make things right, a kind act from a man she had once loved. But Kirill was also the shadow in her life, a man whose chaotic financial irresponsibility meant he owed her a significant amount of money. Kirill was a notorious liar. He had a reputation for spinning elaborate, manipulative fictions, including falsely claiming to have cancer to avoid paying her back. Laureline, a trusting and hopeful person, believed him. She was thrilled about the new house. She had no way of knowing that the house was a lie, a phantom property in a carefully constructed fantasy designed to lure her to her death. Kirill had not offered to help her move her life forward. He had offered to help her move her body. As Laureline packed up her life, her friends began to receive strange text messages from her phone. The tone was off, the language slightly unfamiliar. She claimed she was going on a spontaneous date with a fit vet and mentioned plans to go shopping for a boob job. The messages were a bizarre mix of giddy excitement and strange details, but they were also a complete fiction. Laureline Garcia Berteau was already dead. The messages were being sent by her killer, a cold-blooded puppet show designed to buy him time. Kirill Belarusov, the man who had promised to help her, was at that very moment engaging in a different kind of shopping trip. CCTV cameras at a local hardware store captured Kirill moving with a cold, methodical purpose. He purchased an axe, a pair of plastic clogs, and a roll of heavy rubble sacks, the tools he would use for a gruesome task. On Monday, Laureline failed to show up for work, something completely out of character. By Tuesday, her friends, their unease growing, reported her missing. Police forced entry into her flat. The place was full of moving boxes, and her two beloved dogs were present but strangely subdued. Laureline was nowhere to be found. The search immediately turned to the small garden at the back of the property. An officer noticed a patch of freshly disturbed soil. They began to dig and quickly found her body. Laureline was wrapped in black plastic bin bags, the same kind Kirill had been seen buying. She had been strangled with a ligature. The police now had a murder case, and their prime suspect, Kirill Belarusov, was already gone, having fled the country for his native Estonia by bus. The evidence he left behind was damning. The text messages were a transparent and cruel attempt to create a false trail. Forensic analysis of the ligature found around Laureline's neck revealed trace amounts of Kirill's DNA. The police soon uncovered the full motive. Kirill, intensely pressed to repay his debt, had decided to kill her to erase the obligation. He had concocted the elaborate lie of the new house to put her at ease and then strangled her. He was caught on CCTV buying the tools he would use to dispose of her body. The investigation uncovered a crucial piece of the timeline. Kirill had hired a car on the very dates the false text messages were sent. The mileage on the car corresponded almost exactly to a round trip to the remote locations from which the messages had been sent. The entire alibi was a meticulously planned road trip of deception, with a dead girl's mobile phone as the only passenger. The police tracked Kirill to Estonia, where he was arrested. He continued to deny everything, claiming he was innocent and requesting a speedy extradition to prove it. The trial at the Old Bailey was a methodical dissection of his lies. The prosecution presented the mountain of circumstantial evidence, the CCTV footage, the DNA on the ligature, and the groundbreaking evidence of the forensic linguist who testified that the text messages had not been written by Laureline. Kirill Belarusov was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He had believed he could commit the perfect crime to erase a financial debt, but his own meticulousness and arrogance had led to his capture. This monster, who tried to erase his victim, was brought down by his own deceit. The next story is another chilling example of domestic terror and a mask that hides true evil. Let's travel from the coastal calm to the chilly mountains of Broomfield, Colorado at 8:05 a.m. This time, the clock mattered. On the morning of Thursday, December 14th, 2023, at 8:05 a.m. in Broomfield, Colorado, at a family home garage, Crystal Krug was ambushed. 43-year-old Crystal was an intelligent biochemical engineer, a devoted mother of three, and a woman trying desperately to leave a deteriorating marriage. Her husband, Daniel Krug, 44, a public health official, was outwardly the picture of a concerned family man. But their home life was a facade, a marriage corroded by emotional distance. Crystal was losing control, and Crystal wanted out. For months leading up to this morning, Crystal had been living in a state of high alert, terrorized by a mysterious stalker. This stalker, who called himself Jack Anthony Holland, an ex-boyfriend from her teenage years, sent her a barrage of chilling, obsessive text messages and emails. The messages quickly escalated from unwelcome attempts to reconnect to veiled threats against her and her husband. He even sent photos of her car at the dentist and Daniel getting out of his car at work, chilling confirmation that he was watching them. This campaign of digital terror was relentless, leaving Crystal emotionally exhausted and perpetually afraid. Crystal responded with methodical precision. She created a detailed stalker log documenting every message, every threat. She went to the Broomfield Police Department, her fear palpable in the body camera footage of her interviews. Her home, once a sanctuary, became a fortress under siege. She installed security cameras, took firearm safety classes, and carried a concealed weapon. Her entire family was aware of the so-called stalker, the constant, unspoken threat that hung over their home. And through it all, Daniel played his part, the concerned husband, the victim, the protector, comforting his wife as she meticulously recorded the evidence of her own terror. It was a performance of breathtaking audacity. The man who held her hand and promised to keep her safe was the same man who, in the dead of night, was hunched over a burner phone, typing out the very words that were destroying her. The stalker she was so terrified of was sleeping in the room down the hall. Crystal's decision to leave the marriage sealed her fate. For Daniel, the master manipulator, the game was over. The morning she dropped her children off at school would be her final act as a mother. Crystal entered her garage shortly before 8 o'clock that morning. The overhead door rumbled shut. Her husband was lying in wait. He ambushed her from behind, striking her head with a blunt object. As she lay on the cold concrete floor, he plunged a knife into her heart. The murder was not the end of his plan, it was the beginning of his alibi. With cold composure, Daniel began to cover his tracks. He took Crystal's phone, disabled the home security system, and used a roll of blue masking tape to cover the lens of their doorbell camera. He then sent a series of final, grotesque text messages from her phone to her brother and a detective, messages designed to create the illusion that Crystal had been unfaithful. He left for work 30 minutes later than usual, deactivating his car's dash camera as he drove away. Around noon, Daniel began the final act of his performance, calling the police to request a welfare check, feigning concern when he couldn't reach his wife. The police arrived and found Crystal dead on the garage floor. The investigation immediately focused on the stalker, the mysterious ex-boyfriend, but the script quickly fell apart. The real Jack Anthony Holland was located in Utah and had an ironclad alibi. The focus then shifted to the grieving husband. Digital forensics quickly unraveled Daniel's intricate web of deception. The fake email accounts were traced back to his workplace. The burner phones were purchased with a gift card registered in his name. The final damning evidence was a series of chilling Google searches on his devices, including queries about how long a person could remain unconscious without suffering brain damage. The stalker and the killer were one and the same. Daniel Krug was found guilty of first-degree murder, stalking, and criminal impersonation, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. His months-long campaign of psychological terror, followed by a cold-blooded murder, was an act of ultimate control. This story is a tragic reminder that the monster is often the one you least expect. The transition to the next part brings us to a small, dark alleyway. Let's travel to Mishawaka, Indiana at the chilling hour of 12:05 a.m. This time, everything was there except the person. On the morning of Thursday, December 14th, 2023, at 8:05 a.m. in Broomfield, Colorado, at a family home garage, Crystal Krug was ambushed. It was the frantic, familiar hour of the morning, filled with the chaos of getting 3 children ready for school. Crystal, a 43-year-old biochemical engineer, had just dropped her children off, her final act of motherly devotion. She returned to her seemingly perfect 2-story house on a quiet suburban street, unaware that the real danger lay within its walls. Every electronic communication was a fabricated lie. Every detail pointed to a stranger. No real ex-boyfriend was found. Still, the killer was finally brought to justice inside a locked apartment. The truth was that the monster she had been trying to defend herself against was closer than she ever could have imagined. The danger had not arrived with a sudden external intrusion. Instead, it had seeped into Crystal's life for months in the form of a relentless campaign of digital terror. She had been receiving obsessive, threatening messages from a man claiming to be Jack Anthony Holland, an ex-boyfriend from her past. These messages, which quickly spiraled into vulgar, possessive overtures, were a chilling form of psychological warfare. This digital phantom threatened her life, promising to get rid of her husband, Daniel Krug, so that he and Crystal could finally be together. The terror was immediate, turning her sanctuary into a prison. Crystal was a woman of science and logic, and she fought back with meticulous detail. She created a stalker log, a detailed spreadsheet documenting every intrusion, every message, and every threat. The stalker seemed omnipresent, sending her photos of her car at the dentist's office and Daniel getting out of his car at work, chilling confirmation that she was being watched. Her fear was raw, captured in the body camera footage of her interviews with the Broomfield police. She installed security cameras, took firearm safety classes, and carried a concealed weapon. Her entire family was living in a state of high alert, the threat a constant, unspoken presence. Through it all, her husband, Daniel, 44 years old, played the role of the concerned partner. He was the man whose life was ostensibly being threatened, the victim who stood by his wife as she reported the threats to the police. He comforted her, shared her fear, and supported her desperate efforts to fight the phantom menace. It was a performance of breathtaking audacity, a masterpiece of deception. The man who was her protector, the man whose hands reached out to console her, was the very same man who, in the dark of night, was hunched over a burner phone, his fingers typing out the chilling words that were tearing her world apart. The stalker she was so terrified of was sleeping in the room down the hall. Daniel Krug was the architect of the entire plot, fabricating the stalking campaign himself. He was the puppet master, pulling the strings of her fear, watching with a cold, dispassionate curiosity as his own wife unraveled. The marriage had deteriorated, and Crystal wanted out. Sleeping in a separate bedroom, the couple a fiction maintained for the sake of their children. Crystal's decision to leave was the final, quiet act of rebellion against the man who sought to control her, and it sealed her fate. For Daniel, the master manipulator, the game was over, and he decided to become the executioner. Crystal returned home after dropping off her children and entered the garage. The heavy door closed behind her, and in the dim light, Daniel was waiting. He ambushed her from behind, striking her head with a blunt object, the blows savage and brutal. As she lay unconscious on the cold concrete floor, he plunged a knife into her heart. The woman who had fought so hard against a phantom threat was murdered by the one person she should have been able to trust. The murder was not the end. It was the beginning of his meticulously crafted alibi. With cold composure, Daniel set about covering his tracks. He took Crystal's phone and, in a final grotesque act of impersonation, sent a series of text messages to her brother and a detective, messages designed to cast suspicion on her as unfaithful. He then used her phone to disable their home security system and covered the lens of their doorbell camera with blue masking tape. Surveillance footage from a neighbor would later show him leaving the house, a little later than usual. He deactivated his car's dash camera, stopped for coffee, and then drove to work. The crime was almost perfect, but Daniel's digital footprint was his undoing. The police located the real Jack Anthony Holland in Utah, giving him an ironclad alibi and completely removing him from the suspect pool. The investigation pivoted to the grieving husband. Digital forensics unraveled the entire plot. The fake email accounts were traced back to his workplace, and the burner phones were purchased with a gift card registered in his name. On his devices, investigators found the most damning evidence of all: chilling Google searches, including a query about how long a person could remain unconscious without suffering brain damage. The puppet master was unmasked. The stalker and the killer were one and the same. Daniel Krug was arrested 2 days later. At his trial, the prosecution laid out the case with devastating precision, describing the elaborate month-long stalking campaign as a desperate, manipulative attempt to control his wife before murdering her. The jury saw through the performance of the concerned husband and found him guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, stalking, and criminal impersonation. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a brutal, calculated murder, preceded by months of manipulation, emotional abuse, and deception, proving that a monster can hide in plain sight. The shadow remains a heartbreaking reminder of the day the monster came home. The transition now takes us to a chilling, domestic betrayal rooted in teenage fear and resentment. Let's travel to Mishawaka, Indiana, at the chilling hour of 12:05 a.m. A phone kept ringing, with no voice. On the night of Sunday, December 9th, 2018, at 12:05 a.m. in Mishawaka, Indiana, at an alley behind her home, Brianna Rusalang met her boyfriend. Mishawaka, a city in northern Indiana, was quiet and predictable, a place of high school football games and tree-lined streets. Brianna, at 17, was a star, a cheerleader, a softball coach, and the football team manager. Her life was a canvas of bright, promising colors, a symphony of activity. But beneath this idyllic high school surface, a dangerous secret was growing. The football player planned to kill the child. Every person assumed she ran away. No one saw the violence. Still, a pregnant cheerleader was murdered in a dark alley at night. The truth was that a boy's terror of responsibility had turned into a monstrous, destructive rage. The secret was a simple, world-altering one. Brianna was pregnant. The father was Aaron Trejo, her 16-year-old boyfriend, a boy who moved in a parallel orbit on the high school football team. When Brianna finally shared the news with him, it was not a moment of shared joy, but a catalyst for conflict. For Aaron, the pregnancy was a catastrophe, a problem that threatened to derail the predictable path of his young life. His anger grew, particularly because Brianna had waited too long to tell him. The door to the only solution he considered acceptable, an abortion, had already closed. The anger festered, a toxic, corrosive force. In the twisted logic of his teenage mind, the problem was not the pregnancy, the problem was Brianna. Days leading up to the murder were a slow march toward tragedy. Brianna was 6 months along, the physical reality of the baby becoming more apparent. Her family, though surprised, offered unwavering, unconditional love and support, but in the shadowed corners of Aaron Trejo's mind, a monstrous plan was taking shape. He had been planning it for a week, allowing the idea to take root and grow. His goal, he would later confess with a chilling, dispassionate clarity, was to kill the child. He concluded that if Brianna was in the way, then he would have to kill her, too. The boy who had once held her hand was now methodically planning her execution, procuring the weapons of his monstrous trade, a knife and a black plastic trash bag. On that cold, biting Saturday night, a message came. It was Aaron. He wanted to meet. He wanted to talk. Brianna, a ghost in the sleeping neighborhood, slipped out of her house and walked to the alley behind her home, walking directly to her death. The conversation quickly escalated into a confrontation over the baby he did not want. Then the tension snapped. Aaron pulled out the knife and plunged the blade into her heart. A single, savage act of violence silenced her voice, extinguished her life, and murdered the unborn child she was carrying. The murder was only the first act. He had to erase her. With cold, methodical efficiency, he retrieved the black plastic bag, wrestled her lifeless body into it, and carried her through the sleeping city. He walked to a nearby restaurant and threw her body into a dumpster as if she were nothing more than trash. He then threw her phone and wallet into the river, a final act of erasure, and calmly went home to bed. The next morning, Brianna's mother, Melissa Wallace, awoke with a cold, sickening premonition. Brianna was not in her bed. The initial concern quickly grew into full-blown panic. Melissa called the police, and the investigation began immediately. Detectives quickly learned of the secret Brianna had been keeping, the pregnancy, and the boy who was the father. Aaron Trejo was the last person to have seen her. When detectives found Aaron, he was a picture of teenage nonchalance, initially denying everything, but his flimsy lie quickly crumbled. They asked to see his hands, and they were scratched. They asked to see his shoes, and they were covered in what appeared to be blood. They soon found the knife and the bloody clothes he had worn the night before. The evidence was irrefutable. Faced with the undeniable proof of his guilt, Aaron confessed. In a flat, emotionless tone, he recounted the events, admitting his anger over the pregnancy and the fact that it was too late for an abortion. He told them he had brought the knife with him, stabbed her, put her body in the plastic bag, and thrown her in the dumpster. He then led investigators to the location behind the restaurant. The community was hit with a shockwave of horror. A pregnant cheerleader murdered by her 16-year-old boyfriend, her body left in a dumpster. Aaron Trejo was charged as an adult and pleaded guilty to murder for killing Brianna Ruselling and feticide for killing their unborn daughter, Aurora. At the sentencing, Judge Elizabeth Hurley delivered a devastating critique. She sentenced him to 55 years for the murder and a consecutive 10 years for the feticide, a total of 65 years in prison. The boy who faced a future he did not want chose the most monstrous of solutions. In the end, he was responsible for stealing 2 lives in a dark alley. The next case takes us from a domestic murder to an international tragedy rooted in a system's failure and the vast, dark secrets of a man's violent past. Let's travel now to Upland, California, for the evening of Monday, August 14th, 2025 at 7:47 p.m. The camera turned exactly once. On the evening of Monday, August 14th, 2025 at 7:47 p.m. in Upland, California at the Big 5 Sporting Goods parking lot, a mother reported an abduction. The illusion of safety in the mundane, sprawling landscape of Southern California was shattered by 41-year-old Rebecca Harrow's frantic, terrified scream. She told the 911 dispatcher a parent's most primal nightmare. She had been outside her vehicle changing the diaper of her 7-month-old son, Emmanuel, when an unknown man viciously attacked her from behind, rendering her unconscious. When she woke up, her baby was gone. The initial public narrative was one of unambiguous tragedy. Every detail of the kidnapping was given, no body was ever found. Still, the parents were charged with murder after a child was snatched from a public safe space. The heartbreaking truth would soon be revealed. The kidnapping was a lie, a cynical, calculated attempt to cover up a horrific domestic crime. The response from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office was immediate and massive. The specter of a stranger abduction in a public place is a 5-alarm fire for law enforcement, and an Amber Alert was issued carrying Emmanuel's cherubic baby picture to millions. The community prayed for a miracle, but in the sterile quiet of the interrogation rooms, Rebecca's story began to unravel. As detectives pressed her for details, the inconsistencies piled up, and the story began to feel thin and insubstantial. The experienced investigators grew skeptical, and 2 days after the initial report, the official tone of the investigation shifted dramatically. The search for an unknown male abductor was abandoned. The focus of the investigation was turning inward, toward the two people who should have been Emmanuel's ultimate protectors, his mother, Rebecca, and his 32-year-old father, Jake Harrow. The nightmare had begun in the one place Emmanuel should have been safest, his own home. As the investigation delved into the parents' lives, a dark and disturbing history emerged, one that centered on Jake Harrow. Jake was not just a father, he was, in the words of the district attorney, an experienced child abuser. In 2018, Jake had been convicted of abusing an infant daughter from a previous relationship. Abuse so severe the child was left permanently bedridden. Yet, a judge had granted him probation, an error in judgment that the district attorney claimed allowed this tragedy to happen. The disappearance of Emmanuel was not a random act of violence, but the tragic culmination of a pattern, a cycle of abuse that the justice system had failed to break. The detectives believed Emmanuel was dead and that his parents knew where his body was. On August 22nd, just over a week after the initial report, the charade came to an end. Jake and Rebecca Harrow were arrested at their home in Cabazon and charged with murder. The search for the baby's remains began. A few days after his arrest, Jake Harrow, shackled and accompanied by detectives, was driven to a remote stretch of desert. He walked through the barren landscape, pointing to patches of empty earth, but Emmanuel was not located. The desert held its secrets close. The legal battle began, a difficult no-body homicide prosecution. The prosecution laid out their grim theory. Emmanuel was believed to have been severely abused over a period of time, eventually succumbing to those injuries, with both parents being aware of the abuse. The story of the kidnapping, they argued, was a lie, a cynical attempt to cover up a month-long campaign of torture that ended in the death of a helpless infant. The weight of the crime and the mounting evidence was pressing down on Jake Harrow. In court on Thursday, October 16th, Jake, who had stoically pleaded not guilty a month before, suddenly broke down. He began to cry, his body racked with sobs, and addressed the court. "I want to plead guilty," he said. He pleaded guilty to all charges: second-degree murder, assault causing bodily harm to a child, resulting in the death of that child, and filing a false police report. The facade was gone, replaced by a killer's belated self-serving remorse. Jake Harrow was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, but the plea came with no agreement to cooperate, no promise to lead the authorities to the place where he had hidden his son's body. The secret remained his, a final sadistic exertion of control over a family he had already destroyed. For the family, the grief was compounded by the terrible reality that they could not even give their child a proper burial. Somewhere in the vast, unforgiving desert, a 7-month-old baby lies in an unmarked grave. The ghost of that innocent child haunts a system that failed him. The truth here lay in a sudden, shocking breakdown. The transition now takes us to a dark international incident in Japan, another case of a man with a hidden past. Let's travel to Beppu, Japan, at the evening hour of 8:30 p.m. This time, the clock mattered. On the evening of Wednesday, June 29th, 2022, at 8:30 p.m. in Beppu, Japan, at a busy intersection, two friends waited on their motorcycles. The city of Beppu, nestled on the coast of Kyushu Island, is a place where the earth breathes, steam rising from thousands of hot springs. For students A, 19, and B, 20, Beppu was home, a place of learning and friendship. They were out on their motorcycles, enjoying the freedom of a warm summer night, two friends waiting patiently for the traffic light to change. The man was only on probation, no confrontation was needed. Still, a car was used as a deliberate weapon in daylight. The single, horrific truth was that an impulsive road rage incident by a desperate criminal became a calculated act of murder. The man who would become the architect of this tragedy was Hada Yoichi, a 26-year-old office clerk. Hada was living a seemingly unremarkable life, but beneath the mask of anonymity, a dangerous man was hiding. He was already a convicted criminal, a man with a history of illegal confinement against a woman. Crucially, the Japanese legal system had granted him a suspended sentence. He was a predator on probation, and any new offense would trigger the suspended sentence, sending him to prison for a very long time. He was a desperate man with everything to lose. As A and B waited at the red light, Hada accelerated his car, turning the vehicle into a weapon. He rammed into the back of their motorcycles with a sickening, violent force. The impact was catastrophic. The two young men were hurled through the air. When the chaos subsided, A, the 19-year-old student, lay dead on the asphalt. B was severely injured. The driver of the car did not stop. Hada Yoichi abandoned his car, the instrument of his crime, and fled into the night barefoot. The immediate investigation treated the case as a hit and run, a serious crime, but one that carried a statute of limitations of 7 years. But the victims' families were convinced it was murder, a deliberate act of violence. They pleaded with the police to investigate it as a homicide, a crime with no statute of limitations. The police were slow to act, but the pressure mounted, and the case became a national story. The National Police Agency designated Hada Yoichi as a specially designated wanted suspect, an unprecedented move for a hit-and-run case. A substantial reward was offered for his capture. The investigation continued behind the scenes, desperately trying to prove intent for a murder charge. The breakthrough, the evidence that would finally allow them to reclassify the case as a murder, came from a most unexpected source, a jailhouse informant. While serving his suspended sentence, Hada had struck up a conversation with another inmate, revealing a chilling hypothetical scenario. He had spoken to the inmate about the perfect way to commit a murder, a way to kill someone and get away with it. The method he described was a hit and run. The inmate came forward, providing the missing piece of the puzzle: the motive, the premeditation, the intent to kill. Hada's own words, spoken in the confines of a prison cell, branded him as a murderer. The police discovered that Hada had been involved in a confrontation with the two students just moments before the crash, a final spark that ignited his volatile rage. The fact that he was on a suspended sentence likely added a desperate, cornered ferocity to his actions. With this new evidence, the charge against Hada Yoichi was officially changed from a traffic violation to murder. The statute of limitations was gone, and Hada became a wanted man for the rest of his life. As of the fall of 2025, Hada Yoichi remains a fugitive. He is a ghost, a man who managed to disappear into the vast sea of Japanese society, but he can never escape the shadow of his crime. The story of the two students waiting for a light and the desperate man who turned his car into a weapon is a tragedy without a final chapter. The truth here lay in a whispered confession. The final transition takes us to the case of a devoted mother in a quiet, contained community. Let's move to Delmar, Delaware, for the morning of Friday, April 15th, 2011 at 9:00 a.m. This time, everything was there, except the person. On the morning of Friday, April 15th, 2011, at 9:00 a.m. in Delmar, Delaware, at a wooded property, the investigators finally began to dig. Delmar, a town straddling the Delaware-Maryland border, was a quiet community where life moved with a predictable rhythm. Whitney Lynn Bennett, 23, was a devoted mother to 3 children. Her life centered on building a sanctuary for her young family. But her life had a shadow, a source of instability and turmoil. Her on and off boyfriend, William A. Hill, a man whose life was a revolving door of trouble with the law. Every day was a desperate search. No body was found for 4 months. Still, a family member was the killer near a staff desk. The terrifying truth was that William Hill had turned his relationship volatile into a fatal one, then enlisted his own father to help hide the terrible secret. Whitney was last seen on Saturday, December 4th, 2010, in Maryland, near her Delaware home. When she didn't return, her mother, Robin, filed a missing person report, knowing Whitney would never voluntarily leave her children. The initial police response was measured, assuming she was a runaway, but her family knew better. For 4 long, agonizing months, the search for Whitney Bennett was suspended in a cold, desperate limbo. The Wicomico County Bureau of Investigation focused immediately on William Hill, who was already in custody on unrelated charges, but without a body, the case stalled. The cold winter months bled into the spring, and the hope that Whitney might still be alive began to wither. Then, the break came in the form of a whisper, an anonymous tip that guided investigators to a specific, unoccupied wooded property in rural Somerset County. The tip was chillingly specific. They would find a body. Armed with the tip and a search warrant, investigators descended on the desolate wooded land. They found a patch of ground that was not quite right, a makeshift grave. They began to dig, and the terrible truth of the anonymous tip was confirmed. They uncovered the body of Whitney Bennett 4 months after she had vanished. The devastating reality was that she had been murdered and her body discarded. The discovery transformed the case into a homicide, but the state of the body presented a challenge. The medical examiner could not determine a definitive cause of death due to decomposition. But the investigators knew the truth, and their suspicions settled with laser-like intensity on William Hill. The anonymous tip, they believed, was a crack in the wall of silence that had been built around him. The key to unlocking the case was found not in a fingerprint, but in the whispers and secrets of the Wicomico County Detention Center. A jailhouse informant, a fellow inmate who had gained William Hill's trust, came forward with a shocking story. According to the informant, William Hill had confessed to murdering Whitney and, even more shockingly, had implicated his own father, Claude H. Hill, in the plot. They had killed Whitney and buried her in the woods. The confession revealed a chilling conspiracy. A son and a father bound together by a shared murderous secret. Another source came forward implicating William's stepbrother, Stephen L. Akers, in the cover-up, claiming he helped install cameras at the burial site to monitor the grave. The crime was a cold, calculated murder, followed by an equally calculated attempt at concealment. William Hill was charged with first and second-degree murder, while his father and stepbrother were charged as accessories after the fact and with obstruction of justice. The silence that had surrounded the case for so long had been a family pact broken by a single whispered confession in a jail cell. The case, though complicated by the lack of a definitive cause of death and the reliance on a jailhouse informant, led to accountability. Justice was ultimately pursued in the quiet world of plea bargains, with William Hill held responsible for the death of the woman he claimed to love. The voice gave Whitney's family the one thing they had been denied for 4 long months: an answer. Her story is a tragic and infuriating reminder of the long, slow, but ultimately persistent nature of justice. Would you like me to continue writing the next batch of 5 parts, starting with part 11, or would you prefer a summary of the remaining cases? On the evening of Thursday, October 31st, 1974, at 9:00 p.m., in Deer Park, Texas, at a corner house on the block, the group finished trick-or-treating. Deer Park was a quiet, unassuming suburb of Houston, a place of freshly mown lawns and a solid belief in family and faith. 40-year-old Ronald Clark O'Brien seemed to be the embodiment of this suburban dream. An optician, a church deacon, a choir conductor, and a devoted family man to his 8-year-old son, Timothy, and 5-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. But tonight, this pillar of the community would commit an act so monstrous it would shatter an American tradition forever. A devout deacon gave out death. Every candy was laced with poison. No mysterious stranger was involved. Still, a child died immediately in daylight. The terrifying truth was that the monster was not a stranger, but the man who was supposed to be the protector of the innocent. Ronald O'Brien was, beneath his polished facade, a desperate man. He was drowning in a sea of debt, owing the equivalent of over $500,000 in today's money. He had failed at 21 different jobs in the preceding decade, and foreclosure on his home and the repossession of his car were imminent. The pressure to maintain his respectable image was immense, and he was about to resort to a monstrous solution to his financial ruin. In the months leading up to Halloween, O'Brien developed a strange and sinister new interest: cyanide. He inquired about where he could purchase it, asked a chemist friend how much it would take to kill someone, and peppered his community college professor with questions about poisons. At the same time, O'Brien was quietly, methodically taking out life insurance policies on his children. He had insured Timothy and Elizabeth for a total of $30,000 each, a fact he hid from his wife. A plan was forming in the darkest corners of his mind, a plan to sacrifice his own child on the altar of greed. On Halloween night, O'Brien took Timothy and Elizabeth trick-or-treating, joined by a neighbor, Jim Bates, and his 2 children. As the group approached a dark house on a corner, a home with its lights out and its porch unwelcoming the neighbor, and children moved on. But O'Brien lingered behind in the shadows. A few minutes later, he caught up with the group, his arms laden with an odd prize: 5 giant 22-inch pixie sticks, the powdered candy in long plastic straws. He told the group a strange story. The residents of the dark house had cracked the door and showered him with the candy. No one questioned the odd detail in the happy chaos of the night. He distributed the pixie sticks, 1 to Timothy, 1 to Elizabeth, 1 to each of the neighbor's children, and the 5th to a 10-year-old boy from his church who had joined the group, Whitney Parker. Later that night, back at the O'Brien home, Timothy, tired from the excitement, asked for 1 piece of candy before bed. Ronald quickly steered his son toward the giant pixie stick, the only treat Timothy would have that night. Timothy tore open the plastic straw and poured the sweet, colored powder into his mouth. Immediately, he complained that the candy tasted bitter. Ronald calmly brought him a glass of Kool-Aid to wash the taste away. A moment later, Timothy staggered to the bathroom, convulsing and vomiting violently. The ambulance arrived too late. Timothy O'Brien was pronounced dead at the hospital less than an hour after eating the Halloween candy. The tragic news ignited a wave of panic throughout the community. The police immediately realized the pixie sticks were the source of the poison and began a frantic late-night search for the 4 other straws Ronald O'Brien had distributed. The 2 pixie sticks given to the Bates children were found unopened. The straw given to Whitney Parker was found in his hand unopened. The staples sealing the top had been too strong for his small fingers, saving his life. The final straw, intended for Elizabeth, was also recovered. All 4 remaining straws were rushed to a lab. The results were chilling. The top 2 inches of each straw had been meticulously packed not with candy, but with potassium cyanide, a dose large enough to kill 2 adults in each straw. The candy had been poured on top, and the plastic straws had been resealed with a staple. This was no accident. It was a deliberate, calculated act of murder. The police focused immediately on Ronald O'Brien, the only person who claimed to have seen the mysterious resident of the dark house. They asked him to retrace his steps, but for days, O'Brien claimed a convenient lapse of memory, unable to remember which house it was. Finally, under pressure, he pointed to the home of Courtney Melvin, an air traffic controller. The police, believing they had their man, arrested Melvin, but he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been at work until 11 p.m., a fact confirmed by dozens of colleagues and official timesheets. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for the detectives. Ronald O'Brien's story was a lie. The only person who could have put the poison in the candy was the man who had handed it out. As investigators dug into O'Brien's life, the facade crumbled, revealing crushing debt and the 21 failed jobs. Then, they found the life insurance policies. A call to the insurance company revealed a chilling fact. At 9 a.m. on the morning after his son's death, before the autopsy was even performed, Ronald O'Brien had called to inquire about collecting on Timothy's policy. The man sacrificed his son on the altar of greed. During the search of his home, investigators found a pair of scissors with plastic residue and an adding machine tape on which O'Brien had meticulously tallied his debts, almost exactly matching the amount of the insurance policies. The evidence was now damning, pointing to the motive of greed. Ronald Clark O'Brien was arrested and charged with 1 count of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. He was dubbed the Candyman by the press. His wife testified that she had been unaware of the insurance policies, that he had pushed the pixie sticks on Timothy, and that she had not seen a single tear in his eyes. The jury found him guilty on all counts, returning their verdict in just 46 minutes. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection. At his execution, a large, angry crowd gathered outside the prison, shouting "Trick or treat" and showering the building with candy, a final, bitter condemnation of the man who had perverted a cherished childhood tradition. The story of Ronald Clark O'Brien remains a chilling, heartbreaking reminder of the day a father's greed turned a child's sweet treat into a deadly instrument of murder. The trust of an entire nation was poisoned by this one man. That kind of profound evil never truly leaves you. This story is now closed, but another case of savage violence and mistaken identity waits. Let's move to Roppongi, Japan. At the early morning hour of 3:43 a.m. Everything was there except the person. On the morning of Sunday, September 2nd, 2012, at 3:43 a.m. in Roppongi, Japan, at the Studio Flower nightclub, a group of friends were celebrating. Roppongi is the vibrant, sleepless heart of Tokyo's nightlife, a place of dazzling lights where the city's underbelly operates by its own brutal code. In the exclusive VIP area, the music pounded and the atmosphere was electric. Among the friends was Ryosuke Fujimoto, a 31-year-old restaurant manager with no connection to the criminal underworld. Unbeknownst to him, he bore a striking resemblance to a rival gangster, and his fate was about to be sealed by that cruel twist of appearance. Every bat was swung to kill a rival. No one was the intended target. Still, a man was brutally beaten to death near a staff desk. The heartbreaking reality was that an innocent man was caught in the crossfire of a violent gangland dispute. The architect of this violence was Shinichi Maitate, the infamous prince of cruelty and leader of the powerful Kanto Rango gang. Maitate was a man of terrifying emptiness and a capacity for extreme violence. He was a high-end gangster, but beneath his sophisticated veneer was a savage sadist. A rumor had reached Maitate that one of his most despised rivals, a member of the Kimura Kai gang, was partying at Studio Flower. For Maitate, revenge was a consuming passion that demanded immediate satisfaction. He assembled his crew, a group of 11 trusted henchmen. They armed themselves with metal baseball bats, cold and heavy in their hands, and donned black ski masks, turning themselves into a faceless, menacing force. The plan was simple: storm the club, find the rival, and beat him to death in front of his friends, a brutal message of dominance. At precisely 3:43 a.m., the doors of Studio Flower burst open. The wave of panic was instant, the loud music replaced by the screams of partygoers. The masked figures moved quickly to the VIP area, their eyes scanning for the target. They spotted Ryosuke Fujimoto sitting with his friends, and in the dim, flashing lights and the adrenaline-fueled haze, the resemblance was close enough. His fate was sealed. The attack was a sudden, savage blur of motion and violence. The henchmen descended on Fujimoto, their bats swinging with brutal, relentless force. The sound of metal hitting flesh and bone echoed through the now silent club, a sickening percussion that horrified the witnesses. When the assault was finally over, Fujimoto lay motionless on the floor, his body broken and battered. The masked figures melted back into the night. Ryosuke Fujimoto was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead, the victim of a savage beating. The police quickly identified Kanto Rango and Shinichi Maitate as the culprits, but as they dug deeper, the horrifying truth emerged. Fujimoto was not a gangster. He was an innocent restaurant manager, a random civilian who had been murdered because he looked like someone else. This realization sent a wave of shock across Japan. The media seized on the story, and the pressure on the police to find the killer was immense. While Maitate's henchmen were quickly rounded up, the Prince of Cruelty himself made his escape. A week after the murder, Maitate boarded a flight to Beijing, beginning a desperate cross-continental journey to evade justice. He vanished into the labyrinthine streets of Manila in the Philippines. The authorities issued a red notice for Maitate's arrest, and his face joined the ranks of the world's most wanted criminals. For years, the investigation stalled. Maitate had seemingly disappeared, rumored to be living in luxury, safe from the law. He was a phantom, a ghost in a city of millions. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police later released new digitally altered sketches, imagining what he might look like a decade later, a poignant reminder of the passage of time. The tragedy of Ryosuke Fujimoto's death lies in its utter senselessness, a life extinguished for the sin of looking like someone else. The search for Shinichi Maitate continues, a quest for a justice that is still tantalizingly out of reach. The Prince of Cruelty may have escaped his kingdom, but he can never escape the shadow of his crime. Let's move to South Lyon, Michigan, at the evening hour of 6:30 p.m. This time, everything was there except the person. On the evening of Saturday, March 20th, 1982, at 6:30 p.m. in South Lyon, Michigan, at the corner of 8 Mile and Marmion Roads, Kimberly Louiselle made her final call. 16-year-old Kim was a typical teenager, full of dreams, navigating the landscape of high school and first love. Tonight, she was simply trying to get home. hitchhiking was common and accepted in the area, a casual way for teenagers to get around. Kim had already caught one ride, but she was still miles from the safety of her home. From a gas station payphone, she called her mother, telling her she was on her way home. The girl was only hitchhiking home. Every search led to a dead end. No body was found for a month. Still, the monster's identity was revealed in daylight. The chilling truth was that a serial killer who hid in plain sight was the last man she would ever trust. After making a series of calls that failed to secure a final ride home, Kim stepped away from the relative safety of the payphone and back to the side of the road. She was hoping for a friendly face, turning her thumb toward the headlights of strangers. It was the last time she was ever seen alive. As the night deepened, Kim Louiselle simply vanished, swallowed by the cold, indifferent darkness of a Michigan highway. The next morning, Kim's mother, Joanna, knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Kim was not a runaway. She had been on her way home. But the police dismissed her report as a typical teenage runaway case, lacking the urgency that a potential abduction demanded. For a month, the family was left to their own devices, frantically searching and plastering the town with flyers bearing Kim's smiling face. There was no trace of her. It was as if she had ceased to exist. Then, on April 14th, 1982, nearly a month after she vanished, the agonizing wait came to a horrific end. Kim's body was found in a wooded, secluded area behind a park and ride in the Island Lake Recreation Area just 5 miles from her home. The scene was one of shocking, savage brutality. Kim had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. The most chilling detail from the autopsy was that despite being missing for over 3 weeks, Kim had only been dead for 4 or 5 days. The implication was devastating. She had not been killed immediately. She had been held captive, a prisoner of her abductor for weeks, repeatedly raped and tortured before her murder. The police now had a homicide with no witnesses, no suspects, and a killer who had vanished completely. For 40 years, the case of Kimberly Louiselle was cold, a silent file in the Michigan State Police archives. But Kim's younger sister, Cindy Arthurs, refused to let the silence win, making it her life's mission to find her sister's killer. She became a detective in her own right, tracking down friends and fighting against a system that had let the case lie dormant. In the summer of 2022, the cold case was reopened by a partnership between the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit and students from Michigan State University. Sifting through the dusty files, a long-forgotten lead from a tip in 1983 caught their attention, a name, Charles David Shaw. At the same time, another cold case team was re-examining the 1,983 murder of 19-year-old Christina Castiglione, who had also been strangled and sexually assaulted almost exactly a year after Kim's abduction. Using an advanced technique called forensic genealogy, the investigators sent the preserved DNA from Christina's body to a private lab. The investigation led them directly to the family of Charles David Shaw. The two parallel investigations had converged on a single, terrifying point. The forgotten 1,983 tip in Kim's file contained the name of the man who had just been identified as Christina Castiglione's killer. Investigators went back to Kim's evidence, sending it for retesting using modern techniques that were unimaginable in 1982. The hope for a miracle was desperate. Months later, they got it. A single sperm cell was found in the decades-old evidence, a biological needle in a haystack of time. The DNA from that single cell was extracted, uploaded, and it was a perfect match to Charles David Shaw. The truth was finally known. Charles David Shaw, the man who had lived unnoticed, was the monster who had abducted, tortured, and murdered Kimberly Louiselle. The resolution, however, was bittersweet. Charles David Shaw would never face a jury. He was found dead in his Detroit apartment in 1983. His death ruled an accident. The monster had died not by the hand of justice, but by his own. The identification of Shaw as a double murderer led investigators to believe he may have been a serial killer. For Kim's family, the case was closed by an incredible act of persistence and the power of science to speak from beyond the grave. The ghost of Island Lake has finally been identified, but the long, slow, relentless arc of justice was not fully satisfied. The next case is about the brutal hidden secrets beneath a gilded, opulent facade. Let's travel to Beverly Hills, California at the late night hour of 11:47 p.m. This time, the clock mattered. On the night of Sunday, August 20th, 1989, at 11:47 p.m. in Beverly Hills, California, at the Elm Drive Mansion Den, the perfect family was destroyed. The Menendez name in Beverly Hills was synonymous with the glittering, ruthless promise of the American dream. The father, Jose, was a demanding, brutal executive who had clawed his way to the top. The mother, Kitty, was a former beauty queen. And their two sons, 21-year-old Lyle and 18-year-old Eric, were the handsome, privileged heirs to this gilded empire. But behind the locked gates of the Elm Drive mansion, a dark, corrosive secret was festering. They claimed a mob hit occurred, every cent was spent in a week, no fear of exposure was evident, still 2 people were executed inside a locked apartment. The terrifying truth was that the killers were the victims' own sons, who celebrated their freedom and inheritance with a lavish spending spree. The family facade was a perfect fiction. Jose ruled his sons with an iron fist, his approval always just out of reach. Kitty, often unhappy, was a distant and ineffective buffer. On this warm August night, the pressure cooker that was their home catastrophically exploded. Jose and Kitty were watching television in their den when the calm was shattered by a hail of shotgun pellets. At 11:47 p.m., a frantic, hysterical 911 call was placed. The voice belonged to Lyle Menendez, screaming, "Somebody killed my parents! My mom and dad are shot!" The first officers arrived to a scene of unimaginable horror. The den was a slaughterhouse. Jose lay on the floor, riddled with shotgun blasts, and Kitty was on the sofa, shot 10 times as she tried to crawl away. It was an execution, a crime of such savage, unrestrained brutality that it spoke of a deep personal hatred. Lyle and Eric were outside, seemingly overcome with grief. They told police they had returned late from the movies and a food festival to find the carnage. They suggested their father, a man with powerful enemies, was the victim of a professional mob-style hit. For a time, the police believed the story, investigating Jose's complex and acrimonious business dealings. But as the days turned into weeks, the detectives noticed something strange. The brothers' grief was remarkably short-lived. In the months following the murders, Lyle and Eric embarked on an epic and ostentatious spending spree. They bought Rolex watches, designer clothes, a Porsche, and Lyle purchased a restaurant. Their spending spree totaled an estimated $700,000, an impossible-to-ignore red flag. The suspicion deepened when investigators discovered the brothers had hired a computer expert to erase a recently updated version of their father's will from his computer, a will that had disinherited them. The mob hit theory was collapsing. The focus was turning with a sickening certainty toward the two sons, who seemed to be celebrating their parents' deaths rather than mourning them. The break in the case came from the younger brother, Eric, whose guilt was crushing him. In a series of tearful, tape-recorded sessions with his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel, Eric confessed. He and Lyle had planned and carried out the murder of their parents, driven by a desire to escape their father's oppressive control and alleged abuse. The confession was protected by patient-therapist confidentiality, but Dr. Oziel's mistress, Judalon Smith, who had listened to the tapes, went to the police when her relationship with the doctor soured. Lyle was arrested, and Eric soon turned himself in. The first trial, broadcast on court TV, became a national sensation. The defense, led by Leslie Abramson, argued the brothers had killed in self-defense due to years of horrific and sustained abuse, a story that was close to the truth. The brothers testified tearfully about their childhood as a living hell. The prosecution argued it was a cynical fabrication and pointed to the motive of greed and the brutality of the crime. The two juries were hopelessly deadlocked, resulting in a mistrial. The second trial was different, with one jury and limited presentation of the abuse defense. The prosecution's case focused on the motive of greed, and the brutality of the execution was overwhelming. This time, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for both brothers. They were sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In May 2025, after nearly 3 decades behind bars, a judge resentenced them to 50 years to life, making them immediately eligible for parole. The case remains a complex, tragic epic, a story that refuses to be simple, forever deadlocked between the narrative of greed and the grim reality of abuse. That kind of darkness is unforgettable. The final domestic case takes us to a quiet home with a dangerous secret. Let's move to Del Mar, Delaware for the morning of Friday, April 15th, 2011 at 9:00 a.m. Everything was there except the person. On the morning of Friday, April 15th, 2011 at 9:00 a.m. in Del Mar, Delaware at a wooded property, the investigators finally began to dig. This story of a quiet mother's disappearance had haunted the community for months, a lingering fear in the air. Whitney Lynn Bennett, 23, a devoted mother, had vanished in December, something her family knew she would never do willingly. For 4 long, agonizing months, the search was a desperate, cold limbo. The investigators had long suspected her volatile on and off boyfriend, William A. Hill, who was already in custody on unrelated charges. Every day was a desperate search. No body was found for 4 months. Still, a family member was the killer near a staff desk. The terrifying final truth was that William Hill had killed his girlfriend and enlisted his own father in the cover-up. The breakthrough came from an anonymous tip, a whisper that guided investigators to this specific desolate wooded property. The tip was chillingly specific. They would find a body. Armed with a search warrant, investigators moved into the trees, searching for any disturbance in the earth. They soon found it, a patch of ground that was not quite right, a makeshift grave. They began to dig, and the terrible truth of the tip was confirmed. They uncovered the body of Whitney Bennett. The search was over, replaced by the horrifying certainty that she had been murdered and discarded. The discovery immediately transformed the case into a homicide. But the body's state presented a challenge. The medical examiner could not determine a definitive cause of death due to decomposition. This was a legal hurdle, but the investigators were certain William Hill was responsible. The wall of silence around William Hill was finally broken by a jailhouse informant. The fellow inmate who had gained William's trust came forward with a shocking story. William had confessed to murdering Whitney and had implicated his own father, Claude H. Hill, in the plot. The father and son were bound together by a shared murderous secret. The confession also implicated William's stepbrother, Stephen L. Akers, who had allegedly helped set up cameras at the burial site to monitor the grave. This spoke to a terrifying level of paranoia and depravity, suggesting a cold, calculated cover-up. The investigators now had the full, horrifying picture, a volatile relationship that had reached a fatal breaking point, followed by a meticulous cover-up involving a father and a son. The trio was quickly charged. William was charged with first and second degree murder, while his father and stepbrother were charged as accessories after the fact and with obstruction of justice. The case was built almost entirely on the jailhouse informant's testimony and the circumstantial evidence. The lack of a definitive cause of death and the informant's shaky credibility presented significant challenges for the prosecution. However, the mountain of circumstantial evidence combined with the power of the confession led to accountability. William Hill was held responsible for the death of the woman he claimed to love. His terrible secret and his father's complicity was finally brought into the light. The story of Whitney Bennett is a tragic reminder of the hidden dangers of domestic abuse and the complicity of family in concealing a murder. In the end, it was not forensic science, but a human voice, a whispered confession in a jail cell that broke the long silence and gave Whitney's family the answer they had been denied for 4 long months. Justice, though often frustrating, was persistent. Would you like me to continue writing the next batch of 5 parts, starting with part 16, or would you prefer a brief recap of the cases already covered? On the morning of Monday, July 4th, 2005, at 10:00 a.m. in Richmond, North Yorkshire, England, at the Holly Hill Pub car park, Jenny Nichols' car was discovered. Richmond was a town of cobblestone streets and pastoral tranquility, a quiet place on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales. 19-year-old Jenny Nichol was a local girl, a quiet musician who worked at the town supermarket. 4 days earlier, she had walked out of her family home, telling her parents she was spending the night with friends. Every text message was a complete fiction. No body was found for 3 years. Still, the car was found abandoned in a public safe space. The terrible truth was that a bitter, obsessive ex-lover had murdered her and staged a cruel road trip of lies to cover his tracks. Jenny's parents, Anne and Brian Nichol, had reported her missing after she failed to return or call home. This was not like Jenny. She was close with her family. The discovery of her white Rover 214i, abandoned in the pub car park, was the first chilling piece of evidence. A girl on a camping trip does not abandon her car, and the family's unease turned to a full-blown panic. The investigation quickly uncovered a dark secret in Jenny's life, a long-running secret affair with David Hodgson, a married father of 2 who was 26 years older than her. Hodgson had been grooming her since she was 14. When police first brought him in for questioning, he was a picture of cool denial, denying the affair and any knowledge of her whereabouts, and he was released without charge. Then, the very next day, a miracle, or so it seemed. Jenny's mobile phone, which had been silent for over a week, suddenly switched on. A series of text messages were sent to her family and friends, speaking of a new life, a new beginning, and a need to get away. The messages were a digital trail of breadcrumbs, suggesting she had simply run away. Her mother, clinging to the fragile hope that her daughter was alive, traveled to the towns from which the texts were sent, searching for a ghost. But for the investigators, the messages were too convenient, too neat, and they felt wrong. The police continued to pursue the disappearance, but the discovery of Jenny's car and the sudden fabricated electronic communication suggested a calculated crime. The shadow of David Hodgson never fully lifted. He was a man with a secret, and he was about to make a desperate attempt to cover his tracks. As the summer wore on, the hope of the text messages faded into a renewed, deepening silence. 5 months later, the police shattered the last of the family's hope. The investigation, they announced, was no longer a missing person inquiry, but a murder investigation. The focus returned to Hodgson, whose life was a carefully constructed facade of respectability. Shortly after Jenny's disappearance, Hodgson had been found in a remote hut having attempted suicide by overdose, an act the police viewed as a clear admission of a guilty conscience. In subsequent interviews, his story began to change, admitting the affair but claiming it had ended a year prior. The police began to dig deeper into the toxic relationships in Jenny's final weeks and discovered another layer of betrayal. Jenny had recently started a new relationship with Robert Hodgson, David Hodgson's older brother. The prosecution would later argue that this twisted love triangle had pushed David Hodgson, a man they described as intensely jealous, over the edge. The search efforts, which included soldiers from a nearby garrison, eventually focused on a remote wooded area known as Sandbeck Plantation. Here, in crude hidden huts built by the Hodgson brothers, investigators found heartbreaking physical evidence of Jenny's last days: her nightdress, her teddy bear, and her cassette player. They also found DNA evidence that directly contradicted David Hodgson's claim that he had not been there with Jenny. But even with this mounting circumstantial evidence, the key missing piece was a body. The case, a formidable challenge without the primary evidence, required a scientific revolution. The police brought in an expert in a new field: forensic linguistics. The text messages were analyzed not for content, but for style, grammar, and syntax, their linguistic DNA. The expert concluded that the messages sent after Jenny's disappearance were not written by her. The lie was exposed. The messages were a deliberate, cynical deception sent by someone trying to create a false trail. The police then uncovered that David Hodgson had hired a car on the exact dates the messages were sent, and the mileage corresponded almost exactly to the round-trip distances from Richmond to the remote locations of the texts. The text messages were a road trip of deception with a dead girl's mobile phone as the only passenger. David Hodgson, who believed he had committed the perfect nobody murder, was finally charged and convicted of Jenny Nichols' murder. The trial, a masterclass in circumstantial evidence, proved that a killer could be brought to justice even without a body. He was sentenced to life in prison. The quiet patterns of language, the subtle, almost invisible linguistic fingerprint, spoke a truth louder than any denial. Justice was served, but Jenny's body was never found. A final, heartbreaking question mark. The truth here lay in a chilling linguistic analysis. Now, we travel across the ocean to Maui, Hawaii, for the morning of Monday, March 24th, 2025, at 10:05 a.m. This time, everything was there, except the person. On the morning of Monday, March 24th, 2025, at 10:05 a.m. in Maui, Hawaii, at the Polipuka Trail, a couple began their hike. Maui, with its ancient volcanic peaks and relentless blue Pacific, felt like a paradise, a landscape of profound beauty. Dr. Gart Koeg, a 46-year-old anesthesiologist, and his wife Arielle, a 36-year-old nuclear engineer, had curated a life that, from the outside, seemed perfect and polished. They were a power couple, their combined resumes a testament to ambition and achievement, but the foundation of their marriage was crumbling, eaten away by a corrosive, invisible force. Every step was a climb away from safety. No one saw the initial struggle. Still, a brutal attack occurred in daylight near a staffed desk. The terrifying truth was that the respected doctor, in a cold act of attempted murder, had planned to use the tools of his life-saving trade to extinguish his wife's life. The marriage of Gart and Arielle Koeg was a facade. Gart had become consumed by extreme jealousy, accusing Arielle of having an affair and monitoring her every communication. The man of science had become a man of obsession and control. Arielle alleged he had been sexually abusive and assaulting her for months, turning their beautiful home into a prison. To the outside world, he maintained his chillingly effective mask of the respected doctor and loving family man. By March, the tension in the house was a coiled spring about to break. Gart proposed a solution, a grand gesture of reconciliation, a weekend getaway to the neighboring island of Oahu to celebrate Ariely's 36th birthday. Ariely allowed herself a fragile sliver of hope, unaware that the trip was not a celebration of her life, but a carefully orchestrated plan to end it. The hike Gart chose was the Polipuka Trail, a path renowned for its dizzying heights and sheer 1,000-foot drops, a place of profound danger. The tension between them must have been a surreal counterpoint to the breathtaking beauty of the Hawaiian landscape. They reached a point near the precipice. Gart asked Ariely to take a selfie with him near the edge, a cold prickle of primal fear washing over her. Ariely refused to go near the drop and began to walk away from the precipice, away from him. Her refusal was the spark that ignited his long-simmering rage. "Get over there!" he screamed, his voice no longer a husband's, but a commander's. He lunged at her, shoving her off the trail and toward the cliff's edge. For a split second, she thought it was a grotesque prank, but the murderous intent blazing in his eyes shattered the illusion. In a desperate, reflexive act of self-preservation, she threw her entire body onto the ground, anchoring herself against his forward momentum. The struggle that followed was a primal battle for life on the lonely mountainside. She was screaming, pleading with him to think of their children. When her pleas failed to reach him, he grabbed a rock and brought it down on her head, hitting her about 10 times. Blood streamed from her scalp, blurring her vision. Then the horror escalated to the truly surreal. As she lay beneath him, battered and bleeding, he reached into his bag and pulled out 2 syringes. Gart, an anesthesiologist, knew exactly what to inject and how to stop a heart. The syringes were not a random accessory, they were the tools of his trade repurposed for murder. With a final surge of strength, Ariely wrestled the syringes away from him, her life depending on this single, desperate act of defiance. Her screams saved her. 2 hikers on the trail above heard the desperate cries for help and ran toward the sound. When Gart saw the witness, the bubble of his private rage was broken, and he stopped. Ariely, seeing her chance, screamed, "He is trying to kill me." Gart, his plan thwarted and his crime witnessed, fled down the trail. Ariely was rushed to the hospital with severe lacerations, a broken thumb, and bruises that covered her body. Gart was caught later that evening after a brief foot chase. He was charged with second-degree attempted murder. Before his capture, he had confessed to his adult son, "I just tried to kill Ari. She got away." The syringes, the murder weapons of his profession, were the key. He was held on a staggering $5 million bail, a figure that spoke to the severity of the crime and the flight risk he posed. Ariely survived, her profound strength a testament to her refusal to let go. The monster was not a stranger, but the man whose hands were trained to save lives. It's a shocking case of betrayal in paradise. Now, we travel to the heat and humidity of Tequesta, Florida at the late evening hour of 10:00 p.m. This time, the clock mattered. On the evening of Monday, August 15th, 2016, at 10:00 p.m., in Tequesta, Florida, at the Southeast Cocoa Lane Garage, John Stevens and Michelle Mishkin were relaxing. Tequesta was a quiet, affluent enclave of prosperity where life moved at a leisurely pace. John, 59, and Michelle, 53, had found a comfortable, passionate, late-in-life love. Their garage, which they affectionately called the Garage Mahal, was an open-air sanctuary, a haven of hospitality where they would sit most evenings watching the world go by. Tonight, they were utterly content, unaware that a storm of incomprehensible violence was walking toward them through the darkness. Every detail was a bizarre delusion. Still, the killer was found completely naked, no drugs were found in his system, yet a couple was murdered in daylight. The chilling truth was that a boy in the grip of a sudden, severe psychotic break had turned his mental illness into an incomprehensible, deadly rampage. Miles away, 19-year-old Austin Haroof, a handsome, muscular student at Florida State University, was having dinner with his parents. On the surface, he was the embodiment of the American dream, but beneath the polished veneer, a profound and terrifying darkness was stirring. For weeks, Austin's behavior had been growing bizarre. He believed he had superpowers, that he was immortal, and that a demon was pursuing him. He was scribbling dark, disjointed rap lyrics in a journal about an entity inside him. His mind was a battleground. An argument flared up at dinner. Austin, his face a mask of distress, stood up and walked out of the restaurant without a word. He walked into the oppressive Florida night and began a long 4-mile journey into madness. His mother, frantic, called 911, telling the dispatcher her son was acting delusional and had claims of superpowers. Austin walked for miles, feeling like he was a dog, being chased by a demon. He stripped off his clothes piece by piece, shedding his skin as if it were a prison, until he was completely naked. He was a tormented figure, untethered from reality, walking toward the quiet street where John and Michelle sat. In the sanctuary of their garage mahal, John and Michelle saw the naked young man approach. It was a bizarre, unsettling sight, but their instinct was not to fear, but to help. It was an instinct that would cost them their lives. Austin Haroof, a complete stranger, walked into their garage. There was no argument, no provocation, only the sudden, shocking eruption of a psychosis that had reached its breaking point. He was armed with a switchblade his father had bought him the day before, and he began to attack them. He also grabbed whatever tools were at hand in the garage, turning the peaceful space into an arsenal of makeshift weapons. He attacked Michelle first, beating and stabbing her with savage force. John, seeing his wife murdered, tried to fight him off, and the attack turned on him. The assault was a maelstrom of violence that ended their lives in minutes. A neighbor, Jeff Fisher, heard the screams and ran across the street. He saw the naked young man attacking his friends and bravely tried to intervene. Haroof turned on him, stabbing and injuring him as well, forcing him to retreat and call 911. The crime was a pure, inexplicable act of madness, shattering the peace of the quiet suburban night. The monster had walked right into their open garage. The story is an agonizing one, a reminder of the fragility of the human mind. The investigation continues at the same location, but moments later, in Tequesta, Florida, at the Southeast Cocoa Lane Garage at 10:20 p.m. This time, the keycard chirped at the wrong minute. On the evening of Monday, August 15th, 2016, at 10:20 p.m. in Tequesta, Florida, at the Southeast Cocoa Lane Garage, the first deputies arrived. The Garage Mahal, once a haven of hospitality, was now a scene from the deepest circle of hell. Michelle Mishkin was dead. John Stevens lay on the driveway, barely alive, and hunched over him was Austin Haroof. He was growling, making guttural animalistic sounds, and he was biting John Stevens' face, tearing at his flesh with his teeth. The initial theory, fueled by the bizarre nature of the crime, was that he was high on flakka, a synthetic drug known to cause psychotic episodes, and the media quickly dubbed him the cannibal killer. But the toxicology reports came back clean, only trace amounts of marijuana were found, the easy explanation was gone. The deputies were confronted with a force that seemed to defy the laws of biology. A deputy deployed a taser, the electric shock that should drop a grown man, but it had no effect. Haroof seemed not to notice it, continuing his grotesque assault. They sent in a police dog, a trained canine, but Haruf was unfazed, his strength seemingly limitless. It took multiple officers, a taser, and a police dog to finally pull him off John Stevens's body. As they fought to handcuff him, he screamed at them, "Shoot me! Just kill me!" John Stevens died at the scene, his last words a plea for help. "Get him off me!" The full scope of the horror was revealed. Austin Haruf was in the grip of a severe psychotic break that manifested as a terrifying cannibalistic rage. For 6 years, the families of John Stevens and Michelle Mishkin waited for justice. Haruf's defense argued he was not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming he was in the grip of a sudden psychotic break and did not know what he was doing or that it was wrong. They brought in a forensic psychiatrist who diagnosed him with clinical lycanthropy, the delusion that one is turning into an animal, and acute bipolar disorder with psychotic features. The prosecution, however, argued that his psychosis was voluntarily induced by his lifestyle, a result of his drug and alcohol abuse. The legal battle over his sanity was agonizing. After 6 years of delays, the prosecution's case was critically weakened when their own expert became too ill to testify. The families gathered in the courtroom, bracing for a trial, but instead, the prosecution and defense reached an agreement to allow the judge to rule on Haruf's sanity based on the existing evidence. Before the judge delivered his ruling, the victims' families poured out their raw grief and fury. Michelle's sister, Cindy Mishkin, read aloud dozens of Austin's text messages detailing his history of binge drinking and drug use, concluding her indictment with "white rich boy justice." John's daughter, Ivy Stevens, spoke of her father's last words and told Haruf, "You are not the victim. You're a murderer, a monster, and a coward." Based on the expert testimony, Judge Sherwood Bauer made his ruling, not guilty by reason of insanity. Haruf was committed to a secure state mental hospital where he would remain until doctors and a judge deemed him no longer a danger to society. For the families, it was not justice, but a legal technicality that allowed a killer to escape the consequences of his actions. The case of Austin Haruf is a terrifying reminder that the line between sanity and madness is sometimes thin, and that for some, the deepest wounds are the ones for which the law can offer no healing. The shocking event was a monster in the flesh. The next case is about a terrifying journey from lie to murder, a profound and twisted domestic betrayal. Let's travel to Savannah, Georgia, for the afternoon of Wednesday, November 30th, 2022 at 3:05 p.m. This time, the clock mattered. On the afternoon of Wednesday, November 30th, 2022 at 3:05 p.m. in Savannah, Georgia, at the shared family home, Mindy Cassidus had disappeared. 40-year-old Mindy, a smart, vibrant writer and business owner, had fallen in love with a man of impressive credentials. Her husband, Nicholas Cassidus, was a decorated former Navy Judge Advocate General JAG officer with 2 law degrees, a man of cool, articulate confidence, but their marriage was a prison of lies. Every day was a move to a new town. No one could verify his job. Still, the husband fabricated a pregnancy inside a locked apartment. The horrific truth was that Nicholas Cassidus had murdered and dismembered his wife to erase her existence before marrying his new lover. Nicholas Cassidus had invented an elaborate, terrifying lie. A shadowy government agent named Jim McIntyre controlled their every move. Because of the supposed danger, they were forced to be perpetually on the run, moving over 50 times in just a few short years. This constant motion isolated Mindy, cutting her off from her friends and family, making Nicholas her only interpreter of the invented reality. The web of lies extended to everything. Nicholas claimed to work for Microsoft, but never contributed a single dollar to the household when they lived with Mindy's family. He was also a financial parasite, owing a $1.5 million divorce settlement to his first wife and nearly $200,000 to a former Navy colleague. He was desperate to avoid exposure for his deceit. In the fall of 2022, Nicholas began to add a new chapter to his fiction, telling everyone that Mindy was pregnant and they were expecting a baby in January. It was a lie built on a precipice. At the same time, he was secretly corresponding with a horror fiction author named Samantha Kolsnick online, presenting himself as a grieving widower whose wife and unborn child had died 2 years earlier. The prosecution later theorized this was the breaking point. Nicholas discovered that Mindy was not, in fact, pregnant, and with his new love interest waiting, Mindy was no longer a wife, she was an obstacle. Sometime at the end of November, inside their Savannah home, the fiction collapsed into an act of savage violence. The man who had promised to love and protect her attacked her with a brutal ferocity. The autopsy report later showed Mindy suffered 9 separate lacerations to her head, with one blow fracturing her skull, and bruises and cuts on her hands and arms, clear signs of defensive wounds. She had fought for her life. The murder was only the beginning of his crime. Nicholas then set about the cold, methodical task of erasure. His past as a prosecutor, a man who understood how to clean a crime scene, now served a sinister purpose. His shopping trips in the days surrounding the murder became a timeline of his intent. Receipts showed he purchased Clorox wipes, a shovel, a hammer, and a 7-piece knife set. In a final grotesque act of desecration, he dismembered Mindy's body, severing her legs, an act that investigators believed was done to quickly drain her blood, explaining why little was found in the house. He packed her body parts into plastic storage totes and drove out into the vast, lonely Georgia timberlands. On December 2nd, a hunter found Mindy's torso in a ditch in Riceboro, Georgia, beginning a massive search that would uncover her scattered remains. While police desperately tried to identify the Jane Doe, Nicholas calmly executed his cover-up. He called Mindy's mother, tearfully telling her Mindy had died of a stroke at a non-traditional hospital he couldn't name. 2 weeks after Mindy's torso was found, he drove to Pennsylvania to meet and eventually marry Samantha Kolsnick. The GBI identified the remains through genetic genealogy. The discovery unraveled Nicholas's world of lies, and he was arrested in Pennsylvania. He was found under a new name, Nicholas Killian James Stark, a name he and Mindy had once contemplated using in their fictional life on the run. The trial laid out the full scope of his deception, the lies, the financial motive, the affair, the receipts for the tools of his gruesome trade, and his cell phone analysis that showed his phone went dark for a 2-hour period when the state argued he was disposing of his wife's remains. Nicholas Cassidus took the stand, calm and articulate, never wavering from his lie that Mindy died of a stroke. The jury didn't buy the performance. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 12 counts, including malice, murder, and dismembering a body. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mindy's own body, the brutalized truth of her remains, spoke louder than all of her husband's fictions. Would you like me to continue writing the next batch of 5 parts, starting with part 21, or would you prefer a summary of the remaining cases? On the evening of Thursday, February 23, 2017, at 8:30 p.m. in Garfield, Arkansas, at the side of the road, James Appleton pulled over to finish a call. The Ozark Mountains of northwest Arkansas are a labyrinth of dense forests and shadowy hollows, a land of rugged beauty and deep ancient secrets. Appleton, a 59-year-old water department employee, was talking to his brother-in-law, Andrew Tillman, when his tone suddenly changed. The former police chief wore a badge. Every tip pointed to a stranger. No one suspected 2 crimes were connected. Still, a man was executed under active patrol. The chilling truth was that the killer, a man sworn to uphold the law, was connected to a decades-old crime that would only be uncovered by this one fatal act. The man who would shatter the peace of this evening was Grant Hardin, a former police chief and Benton County constable. Hardin had spent his career in law enforcement wearing a badge, a symbol of protection and order. But behind his polished public persona, a predator was stirring, a man prone to excessive force and a dangerous temper. Hardin and James Appleton were not friends. They were often at odds, their relationship a low-grade, simmering animosity that was about to explode into a fatal confrontation. As Appleton spoke to his brother-in-law, he mentioned that a vehicle had sped past him and then stopped. "I think it's a policeman or something," he said, his voice a mix of curiosity and faint unease. Those were among the last words he would ever speak. Tillman, on the other end of the line, heard a sudden, sharp noise, a loud door slamming, and then silence. The line went dead. When the police found James Appleton, he was slumped over the steering wheel of his truck, a single gunshot wound to his head. He had been executed, shot through the window of his vehicle while he was on the phone, a cold, calculated murder that had been witnessed in a chilling auditory way by his own brother-in-law. The investigation immediately focused on Grant Hardin, given the well-known acrimonious relationship between the two men. When investigators brought Hardin in for questioning, they performed a routine procedural act that would ultimately seal his fate. They drew a DNA sample from him. The investigators were looking for a link to the Appleton murder, but when Hardin's DNA was run through the national database, it didn't just connect him to the recent murder, it lit up a cold case that had been gathering dust for 2 decades. The trail of the killer went back to a terrifying, predatory crime committed 20 years earlier. In 1997, in Rogers, Arkansas, an elementary school teacher had been brutally raped in her own classroom by an unknown man with a gun. The case went cold for 20 years. The DNA evidence from her clothing carefully preserved, a silent witness waiting for science to give it a voice. The DNA from the scene of the 1,997 rape had finally found its match. The 2 dark parallel streams of Grant Hardin's life had converged. The monster who had attacked the schoolteacher and the man who had murdered the water department employee were one and the same. The DNA sample taken for the Appleton murder connected him to a 20-year-old cold case rape. Faced with irrefutable DNA evidence and the weight of 2 separate, horrific crimes, Grant Hardin pleaded guilty. He admitted to the first-degree murder of James Appleton and to the rape of Amy Harrison. He was sentenced to a combined 80 years in prison, ensuring he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. For the families of his victims, the guilty plea brought a measure of grim closure, a sense that justice, though delayed, had finally been served. But for a man like Grant Hardin, a man described as a sociopath with a cunning intelligence, a prison sentence was not an end. It was a problem to be solved. He began to plot. In the Ozark Hills, a cunning predator was merely waiting for his moment. That terrifying moment of escape is where our focus turns next. We move to the same rugged terrain, waiting for the prison gate to open. This time, the keycard chirped at the wrong minute. The justice served in the Ozarks was immediately and shockingly threatened. Despite the combined 80-year sentence, the monster who had once worn a badge and committed unspeakable violence was not content to serve his time. Grant Hardin was a man who saw prison not as a consequence, but as a challenge to be overcome. On the afternoon of Sunday, May 25th, 2025, Grant Hardin put his plan into motion. It was an escape of stunning and audacious simplicity, a plan that relied on exploiting human error. He created a makeshift uniform, a disguise designed to mimic a corrections officer. Clad in this disguise, he approached a secure gate, pushing a dolly loaded with what appeared to be wooden pallets. The uniform worked perfectly. A corrections officer in the control room, seeing a man in uniform performing a seemingly routine task, made a fatal mistake. He buzzed the gate open. Grant Hardin, the convicted murderer and rapist, simply walked out. He disappeared into the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded the North Central Unit in Calico Rock, a ghost dissolving back into the landscape he knew so well. The news of his escape sent a wave of terror through the communities he had once preyed upon. The families of James Appleton and Amy Harrison were re-traumatized, their hard-won sense of security shattered. The ensuing manhunt was massive, involving the Arkansas Department of Corrections, State Police, the FBI, and the Department of Justice. Hardin was not an ordinary fugitive. He was a man with law enforcement training, a man who knew how to think like his pursuers, and a man who knew the land, including where the caves were. For nearly 2 weeks, he remained a phantom, a ghost in the trees, his freedom mounting the fear in the community with each passing day. The end came on June 6, 2025. Search teams, closing in on a remote, heavily wooded area just a mile and a half from the prison, finally found him. The devil in the Ozarks was back in custody, his terrifying taste of freedom over. His capture brought a collective sigh of relief, but it also exposed a shocking lapse in security, prompting an internal investigation into how a man so dangerous was able to simply walk out of a secure prison. Grant Hardin was charged with second-degree escape, a final defiant act from a man who had spent a lifetime manipulating the system he had once sworn to serve. His story is a chilling cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk behind a badge and the terrifying reality that the people we trust to protect us can sometimes be the very monsters we fear. This horrifying event ended with a predator back in his cage. That sense of closure now takes us to a dark domestic betrayal in the heart of Kentucky. Let's move to Bardstown, Kentucky, at the evening hour of 9:05 p.m. This time, everything was there except the person. On the evening of Friday, July 3rd, 2015, at 9:05 p.m. in Bardstown, Kentucky, at the Hull family farm, Crystal Rogers was last seen. Bardstown, the self-proclaimed bourbon capital of the world, was a town of southern charm, a close-knit community where secrets were often kept behind closed doors. Crystal Rogers, 35, was a vibrant, devoted mother of 5. Her life was a constant balancing act of nurturing her large, blended family. But in the final year of her life, a complicated love had entered her world, a relationship with Brooks Hook, a local businessman from a prominent and powerful family. The car was found with keys in the ignition. Every lead pointed to a simple disappearance. Still, the powerful local boyfriend remained silent in daylight. The devastating truth was that the influence of the local family was used to cover up a murder plot born of a desire for control. Crystal and Brooks's relationship was turbulent, a love that was beginning to feel more like a cage, one she was desperate to escape. The 4th of July weekend was meant to be a celebration, but Crystal was expressing her unease, her desire to leave the controlling relationship. On Friday evening, they drove out to the Hook family farm, a sprawling, isolated property on the outskirts of Bardstown, a place where secrets could be easily kept. It was here, on this remote patch of family land, that Crystal Rogers was last seen alive. The next morning, the silence was terrifying. Crystal did not come home. Her mother, Sherry Ballard, a woman whose fierce, unyielding love would become a force of nature, knew immediately that Crystal would never willingly leave her children. The nightmare took tangible form 2 days later. Crystal's car, a maroon Chevrolet Impala, was found abandoned on the side of the Bluegrass Parkway. The car had a flat tire, the keys were still in the ignition, and her purse and cell phone were inside. It was a staged scene designed to suggest that she had simply walked away and abandoned her life. The search for Crystal began immediately, a massive effort by the community and volunteers who formed Team Crystal. But the initial investigation quickly focused on Brooks Houck, the last person to see her alive. He was unnervingly composed, telling investigators a story of an argument at the farm and that she had stayed there when he left with their 2-year-old son. His story was full of holes. The investigation was plagued by local conflicts of interest. Brooks's brother, Nick Hook, was a Bardstown police officer and was one of the first officers to interview his own brother about the disappearance. He was later fired for allegedly interfering with the investigation. The local wall of silence was impenetrable. For 8 long, agonizing years, the case grew cold. Sherry Ballard refused to let her daughter be forgotten, becoming a relentless, one-woman army of justice, organizing searches and relentlessly hounding the police. The turning point came when the FBI finally took over the investigation, bringing a new level of resources and an outsider's perspective. They began to unravel the conspiracy, finding a flurry of late-night phone calls between Brooks Hoke and 2 other men, Joseph Lawson and his father Stephen Lawson, immediately after Crystal vanished. The prosecutors argued that Brooks, desperate to end the relationship and avoid the financial and personal complications of a breakup, had decided to kill her and enlisted the Lawsons to carry out his plan and cover his tracks. The staged scene on the highway was their handiwork. Circumstantial evidence piled up. A white Buick, once owned by Brooks's grandmother, was tracked down. A cadaver dog alerted to the trunk, and a single blonde hair consistent with Crystal's was found inside. The vehicle was a chilling, silent witness. The legal reckoning finally began years later. Stephen Lawson was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence. In a second, highly anticipated trial, Brooks Hook and Joseph Lawson were tried together. Brooks Hook was found guilty of murder and tampering with physical evidence and was sentenced to life in prison. Joseph Lawson was also convicted and given 25 years. The men who had stolen Crystal Rogers from her family were finally held to account. The ultimate tragedy is that Crystal's body has never been found, her final secret locked away in the minds of the men who killed her. Her story is a testament to the fierce, undying love of a family that refused to give up hope. This story ends with a family's triumph over a small-town conspiracy. The final domestic betrayal is a medical mystery. Let's move to Houston, Texas, at the early morning hour of 2:30 a.m. This time, everything was there, except the person. On the morning of Thursday, February 23, 2017, at 2:30 a.m. in Houston, Texas, at his twin sister's bedroom, Benjamin Elliott was asleep. The Elliott family in Harris County lived a picture of suburban contentment, raising 2 sets of twins. The youngest, Megan and Benjamin, were fraternal twins, inseparable and deeply bonded. Megan was the social butterfly, vibrant and outgoing. Ben was the quiet, gentle soul. They were, in the words of their parents, best friends. They were twin best friends. No motive was ever found. Still, the boy woke up with a bloody knife inside a locked apartment. The astonishing truth was that a boy, betrayed by his own sleeping mind, was charged and convicted of the murder of his own sister. Sometime in the dead of night, in the deep, dreamless hours before dawn, Benjamin Elliott rose from his bed. It was not the Ben his family knew. He moved through the house like a ghost, disconnected from his gentle soul. He went to the kitchen and retrieved a knife. He walked to his twin sister's bedroom, and with a chilling, mechanical precision, he began to stab her again and again. The silence of the night was broken not by a cry of rage, but by the sickening, repetitive thud of the blade. The girl who had shared his life from the very beginning was being murdered by her other half. Ben's body now still, his mind began to surface from the depths of whatever dark place it had been. He woke up confused, feeling a sharp pain in his hand and seeing a cut he couldn't remember receiving. It was then that he saw it, a blood-covered knife lying on his bed. A cold, primal fear washed over him. He had no memory of what had happened, only a terrifying sense that something was profoundly wrong. He went to his parents' bedroom, and his voice, a choked whisper, said, "I think Megan's dead." His parents, jolted from sleep, rushed to Megan's room. The scene that greeted them was a parent's worst nightmare. Their daughter, their vibrant, beautiful Megan, was lying in her bed, her life extinguished. The parents' screams of anguish ripped through the quiet suburban night. Benjamin Elliott was taken into custody, a 17-year-old boy who claimed to have killed his twin sister but had no memory of doing so. The investigation searched for a motive, combing through Ben's life, his school records, and his texts with Megan, which were a testament to their close, loving relationship. There was no fight, no argument, nothing to explain the savage, murderous rage. The only clue came from Ben himself. He had no memory of the attack, only a vague, fleeting image of a figure in a dream. The defense seized on this, building a highly unusual and audacious defense, the sleepwalking defense. They argued that Benjamin Elliott was not a murderer, but a parasomniac, a person who had committed a complex, violent act while in a state of non-REM sleep, a phenomenon known as homicidal somnambulism. They pointed to Ben's history of childhood sleepwalking and the cut on his hand as a classic sign of an injury sustained during the act that he only became aware of upon waking. The trial was a battle of experts, a high-stakes debate over the nature of consciousness and the limits of responsibility. Ben took the stand, weeping, as he spoke of his sister and the guilt he felt over an act he couldn't remember. The jury was left to grapple with an impossible choice. In the end, they chose a middle path, a compromise. They found Benjamin Elliott not guilty of murder, acknowledging the sleepwalking defense, but found him guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The judge sentenced Benjamin Elliott to 20 years in prison, the maximum sentence for manslaughter. But in a final, compassionate twist, he suspended the prison sentence and instead placed Ben on 10 years of probation with strict conditions, including wearing a GPS monitor. It was a sentence that acknowledged both the gravity of the crime and the profound mitigating strangeness of its circumstances. The killer twin was a victim of his own mind. A chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that live inside us, waiting for us to fall asleep. The final transition takes us back to a brutal international incident of planned road rage. Let's move to Beppu, Japan at the evening hour of 8:30 p.m. This time, the clock mattered. On the evening of Wednesday, June 29th, 2022, at 8:30 p.m. in Beppu, Japan, at a busy intersection, two friends waited on their motorcycles. Beppu, with its sulfurous steam and thermal springs, was a city of unique beauty. The two friends, A and B, were students, enjoying a warm summer night. They were simply waiting for the traffic light to change when their world collided with a man who had turned his desperation into a lethal weapon. The man was only on probation, no confrontation was needed, still a car was used as a deliberate weapon in daylight. The brutal reality was that a fugitive, fearing a return to prison, had used his vehicle to commit murder in a calculated act of road rage. The man behind the wheel was Hara Yuichi, a 26-year-old office clerk with a history of criminal confinement. Crucially, Hara was on a suspended sentence. Any new offense would send him to prison for a very long time. He was a desperate man with everything to lose, and an altercation with the two students moments before the crash was the final spark that ignited his volatile rage. As the students waited at the red light, Hada accelerated his car, ramming into the back of their motorcycles with sickening force. The impact was catastrophic. Student A, 19, was killed instantly, and B was severely injured. Hada abandoned his car, the instrument of his crime, and fled the scene barefoot, disappearing into the night. The initial investigation treated the case as a serious hit and run, but the victims' families knew it was murder. They pleaded for a homicide charge which carried no statute of limitations. The police launched a national manhunt, and Hada Yoichi was designated a specially designated wanted suspect, a highly unusual move for a traffic violation. The key to proving murder and intent came from a highly unexpected source, a jailhouse informant. While serving his suspended sentence, Hada had struck up a conversation with another inmate, revealing a chilling hypothetical scenario. He had spoken of the hit and run as the perfect way to commit a murder and get away with it. Hada's own words, spoken in the confines of a prison cell, provided the missing piece of the puzzle, the premeditation and intent to kill. With this new evidence, the charge against Hada Yoichi was officially changed to murder. The statute of limitations was gone, and Hada became a wanted man for the rest of his life. He remains a fugitive, a ghost on the run, a man who managed to disappear into the vast anonymous sea of Japanese society. But he can never escape the shadow of his crime. His story is a chilling reminder of how easily a traffic dispute can turn into a cold, calculated act of murder when desperation and a criminal history are involved. Would you like me to provide a brief recap of all 25 stories, or would you like me to look up more details on any specific case, such as the full verdict of the Menendez brothers parole board?